Hello, everyone, and welcome to the most dysfunctional start to any podcast we've had in months. I'm your host, Spencer. This is Constructive Criticism, and I am joined by my co-host, a man whose camera can't decide how to freaking act, Abe Stein.
Yeah, it's really just doing its own thing forever.
And a man who just wants to be invited, Mason Clark.
Invite me. I love inside jokes. It's so good.
I literally don't know what it means, so it's an inside joke between you and Abe, and I am with the audience completely lost.
One time Abe said, invite me. I'm very fun at parties after you well actually someone, and I'll just never forget. He's like, well actually someone, and then he just goes, invite me.
Okay.
And I'll never forget
This was like 3 or 4 months ago at this point, so yeah, it's really topical.
It's been top of mind for Mason for so long that he had to like say it 6 times before we started. Let's be honest, guys. Like we haven't done this in a while.
Week off. Good for the soul.
But like this, like the three of us, the three amigos, the three musketeers.
I feel like that's why we're all bouncing off the walls. You know?
Yeah, we're like so excited to see each other.
Yeah, I think it was all October. We didn't have a 3-personer.
Yeah.
Well, these 3 people. We had guests and stuff, but
yeah, That's good to be here. That's not the point of the show. The point of the show is to be always improving, to be better today than you were yesterday. And Mason, I'm gonna mix up this format. I'm gonna let you go first because we're dying to know.
No, show notes are important. You have to respect the show notes. You're up first, Spencer.
I have to respect the show notes.
I'm trying to practice respecting the show notes, and so do you. You're up first. Parmesan goes last.
Okay. The Parmesan teaser. Yeah, so I will go first then. I'll respect the show notes. I think that's fair. So lately I've been working on work. Starting a new job has been rough, especially when my son has been in the hospital twice. So for those who don't know, like, you know, I've been missing weeks, and like for some of those weeks it was because my son had to be monitored. He, you know, was having breathing problems, and if you're a parent, you're probably pretty worried about RSV if you're a parent of a young kid. And my son happens to have asthma and also happened to get respiratory virus. So it was a rough month in October, to say the least. With that being said, though, since our last episode, I did get to play a bunch of Mono Blue. And there are 2 cards that I want to highlight, and also say that we're going to record a bonus episode on the deck because congrats to Mason for winning his RCQ with Mono Blue in Standard. But there are 2 cards that I want to highlight that I've been really impressed by. The first one, and the one I want to talk about the most, actually we'll just talk about the one, is March of Swirling Mist. That card, when I first saw it, it was like an immediate cut for me in deck lists. I was like, there's no way this is good. Tried it again, and this card was one that just kind of goes to show, like, maybe don't make assumptions about deck lists before you try them, and actually try out stuff. This card just wins games that you have no right winning by wiping your opponent's board for a turn when you have like 5/5s in play that are like stalled out because of, you know, how much stuff can be in play. And then the fact that it is it gets cheaper for 1 when you have the it just turns into like a phase your own guy out when you have the Djinn in play. And then it also can like save your board from a wrath, which nothing else in your deck can do. The card is actually totally bonkers in the deck. And, you know, it is... I don't know that the always improving moment is more about not changing deck lists before you try them, or if it's more about understanding, like trying to understand why somebody would put a card in the deck. But that would be my always improving moment around Mono Blue. Yeah, that's it for me. Any thoughts on that, guys?
I'm really happy you brought up the like kind of pseudo dive down you get to do with it and Haughty Djinn, because I feel like that's something where when I first saw this list, I was like, okay, I guess you can like kind of get rid of any blockers for like Tolarian Terror or whatever, or, you know, but using the whole buffalo, as it were, and being able to use it on your own creatures, kind of dodge removal spells, or even sweepers, like you were saying, I feel like is something that at first glance you're like, what does this card even do? But I'm glad that as you've been playing with it, you kind of found that all the use cases are really important. So I feel like that's a really, really cool aspect of that card.
Yeah, the pseudo dive down is sick, right? Because it's just like a dive down for easily your best creature, but also, there people be trying different wraths out to try and figure out which wraths are the best, and this is a good way to stop that.
Yeah, I think you kind of mentioned how you're like, I don't know if like this is how to say they always remember this, but what kind of jumps out to me about it is it's like, think about cards and how they interact with the format, not only the format, but also the deck you're presenting, right? And it's like a good example that is like, oh yeah, Hottigen in this, it does create like a dive down or like, basically tap target creature, right? And like, that's kind of like interesting and like does a unique thing. Like maybe that's worth considering playing.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, what about you?
Yeah, so my always improving moment has come from helping people with their process for preparing for the upcoming RC in the US. So I have a lot of friends who are qualified are really, really trying to kind of be on the cutting edge of Pioneer right now. And something that I know in the past, and something that I even do a lot when I'm preparing for just regular like week-to-week tournaments, is I'll really have to push myself when it comes to responding positively to new ideas. Because it's really easy to fall back on the idea of just doing things that are proven. And so something that I've really been trying to do in this process that I feel has really helped me have some really good conversations about, cards that are being previewed or even just decks that I might not have considered or ideas that are being considered is to kind of say yes first and explore the whole idea and really remind myself that that's a much more important thing to do for a tournament like the RC than maybe it is for when I'm playing my local 2K or my local RCQs. Of like, yeah, I could probably just bring Rakdos or bring, whatever modern deck I feel is good that weekend and not get too fancy, not get too cute. But when you really have a lot of incentive to do well, you have to look towards unconventional ideas, the things that people wouldn't necessarily try when the incentives line up for you to just do the proven thing over and over again and do it well. And that's been something that I think has been a struggle for me in the past, and really focusing on doing that in the groups I'm in as a role of someone who doesn't necessarily have the same skin in the game as someone who's qualified and is playing the event, but giving them a space to explore their ideas and be a bounce more for them has been really a valuable thing for me this last couple of weeks.
That's awesome. I'm not gonna lie, I thought you were gonna use your always improving moment from our group chat, so I'm happy to hear this one.
I would never double down, baby.
It's not doubling down. I have an always improving moment. I yelled at Abe before the start of the show, and I just realized that the mistake was actually on my end. And I'm sorry, Abe. I appreciate that. Mason.
Yeah, so my always improving moment comes from this idea that I kind of had for a while now, and really giving a name to it and kind of fleshing it out. I wrote a whole thing that currently is on my Patreon, but maybe it's going to end up on Card Kingdom or somewhere too. I don't know. But basically, the idea is called Parmesan. That's what Spencer mentioned earlier on the show. He's like, I got to know what Parmesan is. I just wrote Parmesan in there. Follow me on Twitter. You saw me tweet about it. And it's like a whole article thing to really get into it, but I'll try and TLDR compress it here for listeners. The idea basically is
hold on, Mason. Before you go into this, I want you to sell me on Parmesan. I want you to have constructive criticism by this Parmesan article. So that's what's happening right now.
Okay.
So I'm going to pay you more than the mana traders if you sell me.
Okay, I can't publish articles on other websites.
Oh, well then never mind. I'll edit this out.
Okay. Yeah, unfortunately I have a non-compete clause there, but apparently Patreon doesn't count. That's what I was told, which seems weird, but okay. Whatever, don't argue. So basically, the idea behind it is, if you've played other games, like other strategy games, stuff like that, you maybe heard of like a chi strategy, right? So if you played StarCraft 2, for example, there's like 6 pooling someone, which is because all in kind of gambit, right? And cheese decks exist in Magic, And, a great example of this, if you're trying to think of one, is the Tybalt Trickery deck in Pioneer that we saw Aspiring Spike kind of promote. And everyone kind of accepts it's a meme, but you see it a lot in leagues because it's fun. And, it 2-3s, 3-2s, and just leads to these crazy, wacky games. But often, cheese strategies can be sort of broken up and picked apart, and then you're so all in on them that you lose. So those are cheese strategies, right? But if you have a good pasta, or like a good salad, sometimes you put a little Parmesan on the top, right? A little cheese. So a lot of people would call this like a splinter twin, right? Like they would say like, oh, my deck has a splinter twin element to it. But I think that actually does a really poor job of conveying what your deck is trying to do. And so I came up with the word Parmesan because your deck has a little bit of cheese in it, but it's not all in on it. So 2 good examples of this are Underworld Breach and Current Modern. That deck can play a fair, grindy, sort of tempo-y game. It can do either of those, or it can combo kill you. Now, that deck leans a little bit maybe in more on the combo than a lot, but there have been past iterations of the deck that don't do that, like in early March with Jessie Robkin, who guested on the show. Her deck was much more a tempo deck that had the combo built in. Now it's kind of more of a combo deck with a tempo thing. And then we've seen in Legacy, actually, over the last month, friend of the show, Samantha, she had a tempo Doomsday deck that she brought to the Legacy pit. And basically the idea was like, hey, I'm playing basically like Grixis Murktide, but I also have Doomsday and Thassa's Oracle in my deck, and I can play these multiple game plans. And so she kind of is like, hey, I'm playing this fair deck, but I also have this oops, I win thing. And so I go a little bit more into it. I talk about pseudo wins and sort of hard wins. But basically the Parmesan theory is you present a deck that presents a real game plan, but has some backdoor thing that's oops, I win. And I have different like layers of it. So for example, Hammer Time like kind of has some oops, I win to it, but like you maybe wouldn't call it Parmesan deck.
Thank you. Like I was always improving during this part of the segment, so that was great, Mason.
No.
Really quickly, just want to give some Patreon shout outs. Shout out to Larry and Mark. Thank you so much for being a part of the show. Really quickly, this has been a recurring theme, and I don't think these guys have joined the Discord yet. You should be getting a welcome message in the form of either an email or a message on Patreon that has the link to the Discord for you when you join. That was not happening both for us and for Drafting Archetypes this last month. So if it's not happening, please message us on Patreon and we can continue to do that. I do believe it's fixed because I haven't heard any more reports of it. But if you are listening to this, you're like, hey, I never got that message, let me know. I'll be happy to make sure that you get that. Some quick housekeeping. Guys, isn't this shirt sick? Like, isn't it so cool for the audio listeners?
Yes.
I've been thinking about how good that blue and white G with Lehigh under it looks on that nice hexagonal kind of honeycomb grid.
Yeah, it's a game grid. Get it? Yeah. Honestly, our sponsor Game Grid is so amazing. I've been there so much to buy cards recently as I'm building up my Magic collection again, and they are absolutely fantastic. The owner Jordan has now made all of their store championships a 1Ks, and then he also made all of their RCQs this season standard, listening to feedback from none other than us, the people. So I just think that, like, if you don't have you're hesitant on where to spend your Magic dollars, Game Grid is a great place to do it. You can use the code CCMD10 at checkout, get 10% off your first order, and then you can just use the link in the show note, and it gives a little bit of a kickback to us. Mason likes kickbacks because he gets to spend it on Flaming Hot Cheetos, so.
And Parkelians.
And Parmesan, so.
I don't actually like that much Parmesan. That's the dirty secret about all this. But the idea came to me, and it's like a little Parmesan.
In an Olive Garden somewhere, I was just thinking.
PV would be so proud. Last bit of housekeeping is that our standard event is still, coming up. We're still doing that Q4 event. So make sure to head over to the link in the show notes to sign up. It will be on Arena, free entry to all patrons of $10 or more. Greatly appreciated. And also, like, I think that we're in a really cool standard format. That it's funny that people are like, oh, Jun's the best deck, like, after 1 week, and they're like, I don't even think that's true. Like, I think that there are so many decks in this format that can win. I actually think Grixis is the best deck in this format, followed by Esper. So it was really funny to see like the week 1 reactions after the ban and being like, oh, it's all done. This format sucks. It didn't even matter. So, yeah. Check that out. Let's go into a training grounds. Our main topic this week is a modern deep dive. In perfect timing, the last time we talked about modern, Mason, you actually gave us a really in-depth guide on how to play 4-color Yorion. How has modern changed since then?
They banned Yorion. And that has had some drastic ramifications on the format. The top end of what you're kind of able to do and the pressure when it comes to control decks has shifted some, despite there being some decks that look maybe reminiscent, when you kind of quickly glance at them, to what the Yorion deck was.
I have 2 questions. 1, what percentage of this is your fault? And 2, how do you, as a Yorion, extremist, as I will call you, feel about this change?
Well, 1, I would say it's a lot my fault. We don't have to get into how my deck lists are the ones that ever won big tournaments in the States. It's fine. But we can move on. I think the thing that has changed the most is the thing that I've taken away from it, the banning and looking at the new 4-color decks, is actually something I think Abe said on that episode, or maybe it was the episode of the banning, but Abe basically said there's something to like answer density where the deck was able to play so many answers, and maybe you didn't have the right answer at the right time, like we had talked about in the deep dive episode, where you have something to answer a turn 1 creature, but sometimes it's bolt, sometimes it's prismatic ending, sometimes it's coatl, right? Like you have something to do in the first turn cycles, but you don't always have maybe the optimal one where you have to make it a little awkward. The deck can no longer, because really it had about 12 extra cards. You had 8 more lands in the deck, and those 12 extra cards really mattered. And having, Yorion be there to flicker your abundant growth and kind of draw into more answers and be a thing to win the game has really changed the deck. So, not having that huge density of answers and that free thing to win has forced these decks to really change and turn to much, much more like blue-white control decks of old, and can't really turn the corner in that same impactful way.
Let's talk about what?
Well, that and Karuga now is kind of taking over that spot, but we'll talk about that later in the show.
Cool. Let's go on to kind of the decks that are doing well. I think the first one was... I was really surprised to hear people say that they did not think that this deck would suddenly take over the format. In fact, I heard people say the opposite, but number 1 deck, it's Murktide. Abe, what are your thoughts on this deck after the bannings?
Yeah, I mean, for one, I think that the biggest thing keeping me from wanting to play Murktide myself was the 4-color matchup. That had kind of a matchup that over time had evolved as the Murktide players had to figure out how to beat what the 4-color players were doing, and it was this big, high-level strategic arms race that you could see play out in the challenges week over months. And it was just such an important matchup to know how to navigate that if you didn't have that knowledge, it was a pretty big barrier to clear. But without 4-color, Murktide really is just back to being the thing that is the check on the format, in the way that 4-color was kind of a check on Murktide once it came about on Murktide and Hammer. So I think that it's just really hard in a format now where the best card has gone from being Renin 6 and Yorion to being Ragavan, to say that the deck that is the best deck at being a Ragavan deck is anything but the de facto best deck.
Yeah, I'll jump in really quickly. I think that there was a tweet, I don't remember who it was, but they were people think that Boomer Jund is, X or Y in Modern. And the truth is that Boomer Jund is just straight up Murktide. And I said, I've been saying that since I picked it up. As somebody that's played a lot of both of these decks, that is what this deck is. It is this 50-50 deck that if you decide to do something even a little off the beaten path that doesn't beat it, it becomes a 90-10 deck, and you're not gonna beat that. But that means that it's right now a 55 deck, and as somebody that plays has been learning a game that a lot of matchups are in that zone, right? That 55, 60, 45 zone. Those percentage points are really impactful. I think that this deck does a couple things. It was really cool to hear some of my local players talk about the Blood Moon versions of the deck and like going back to something like that. But also just seeing there's been a lot of variations in lists in this deck that were not happening other than the number of Murktides. Like it actually opened up the number of flex slots for this deck quite a bit. Mason, you've played it probably against this deck more than any of us. I want your thoughts.
Yeah, I think the good description is the Jund, like we've been mentioning on the show. And I think another way to kind of look at it is like, if your deck isn't efficient, the efficiency of Murktide will sort of bully you out of the game, and it will, almost like a school bully, make it known your insecurities. Like, oh, your deck's a little clunky. Like, that's not allowed to be happening here. Counterspell, hit you with Riot Man again. And that sort of element to a deck, I think, is really powerful. And I think the Murktide deck kind of does that better than maybe only Hammer does it more, but Hammer doesn't punish you in the same way. And I think that is kind of the difference where Murktide can answer a more robust amount of strategies, and Hammer answers them by killing them and punishing for the inefficiencies. But Murktide kind of, just stops what they're doing sometimes. So it's a strong deck in the format.
To me, really, I think that if I had to draw an analogy between Murktide's positioning right now and anything else going on in Magic, I would say it kind of benefits from the same positioning as Rakdos Midrange and Pioneer, where it is the least easily exploitable deck in the format of all the decks that existed before. I think that if you want to beat Murktide, you have to structurally change the way that you're approaching the game in deck building. Like, what your game plan is has to be something that's attacking what Murktide wants to do, and that's just really hard to do while also handling the broadness of the format. So Murktide gets to be just the pile of the best and most efficient things to do with the best haymakers and the best interaction, and it really says you need to clear this bar if you want to get past me.
I'm going to just dive a little bit deeper into this. Like, if you think about Jund decks historically, and even this Rakdos deck, right? And you think about the type of cards that they play, right? Those become Thoughtseize into something decks. The only difference here is that it's something into a counterspell or something into an interactive spell, right? The interaction just swaps places. It's not, and it's because of the type of things that get to happen. Because this deck gets to play Dragon Rage Channeler and Ragavan, it then switches. In all honesty, it's really similar to how Grixis Death Shadow operated, where with Ragavan, where it's like, okay, well, I'm going to play DRC, Ragavan, and this, and like try to either disrupt you early and then play Haymaker, or it's the same thing. And the Thoughtseizers just become different types of interaction. And I think that is the thing that people sometimes miss. Like, they think this is like a tempo deck, or they think this is like this really heavy control deck, and that's just not what it is. It is a mid-range deck keeping the format in balance.
Yeah, I will say this too. Much like a mid-range deck of old, like, and Jund or Rakdos, from Pioneer and current times, it does also have some similar issues, but cards like Expressive Iteration make those issues not as prominent. And so
we don't talk about that on this podcast. We don't want that card banned on this show.
Sure. Well, I feel pretty comfortable talking about it. But yeah, Expressive Iteration, I think, is a pretty big, fixing point for like the Jund problems historically of running out of stuff and like not being able to sculpt your game perfectly. That combined with the like efficiency and when it comes to mana of the threat, I think changes it from like Boomer Jund to now. You know what I mean? So.
Well, speaking of Expressive Iteration, let's talk about our next deck. Mason, why don't you tell us what it is?
Yeah, so Underworld Breach, this is the other kind of blue-red deck. This one's mostly Jeskai these days, although there are some variations in the Breach deck. We've seen Teamer Breach, playing Brennan 6 in order to have a more fair game plan with Urza Saga as the game goes along, and use things like Boseiju to beat some of the hate presented your way. And we've also seen Mono Red Breach, which is much more leaning in on things like DRC to have that sort of tempo-y game plan we saw back in March from the Izzet builds of the deck, but have better mana and be a little cleaner. And so those are kind of the different Breach, but for the most part, when people talk about Breach, I think they talk about the Jeskai Breach deck, which Corey Baumeister won the Modern Challenge with about a week ago now. And we have seen be pretty big proponents from a lot of people. Jesse, who you guys on the show a little bit's a big fan of this deck. Corey's a big fan. Ross is a big fan, and they like talk about it on Twitter a lot. And it's a very good deck. It can play games similar to sort of tempo-y style decks and go a little long and grind with Urza Saga, but then it has that Parmesan factor, where it has the combo element to it that actually just goes over the top and wins. And we're seeing a lot of different variations also, even within the Jeskai archetype of the deck, Ledger Shredder, Fable the Mirror Breaker. So still a lot of room to explore in this deck, and I don't think we found the best version of this deck. But I think there's something just to this kind of core shell of, Unholy Heat, Ragavan, and something is really good. Murktide players pair with Counterspell. These players go more in leaning in that combo direction. And so,
Abe, you obviously were on the episode with Jesse, and I was not. The question I posed to you is like, was Emery Urza Saga inevitable? Like, was that always going to end up happening?
Just in the format in general, I think that, Emery is just such a powerful card that only gets better the more and more artifacts they print, and Emery Bauble especially is just a really powerful engine. I think my feelings on the Breach deck, I was actually thinking about this on the way home from work today, is that the big thing that makes the deck in such a good position right now, and the thing that has really given it an edge over the last few months, has been that it is the deck that is least vulnerable to Solitude while doing something fundamentally unfair. And also still playing to the board. Like, it does all of it, because all of its cards it plays to the board are either card positive on that kind of interaction with Solitude, which has been the tool in interacting with decks that are trying to do something unfair, especially as Hammer has been the primo get you dead quickly deck that has an unfair angle. Like, the fact that Emery is the only thing really vulnerable, and that is only 1 mana, and you're playing a bunch of things you would naturally play anyway to enable it. And then it's like Ragavan, Urza Saga, all these cards that line up so well against this one specific card that is bearing a ton of weight from all of the fair decks, really has made it so that that Breach has just benefited from being in a really good position.
Yeah, my first interaction with this deck was actually on coverage. I had not been following the Corey Baumeister saga of this deck, and I had to cover this deck multiple times at our RCQ at Game Grid Lehigh. And honestly, my first thought was just like, sick. Like, a deck that gets to play Mox Amber is like the hottest thing since sliced bread. Like, that's so cool. So, yeah. So next up we have creativity. This deck is really interesting in that I think this deck has maybe evolved the most. You guys can correct me if you think I'm crazy for saying this. Like, in the last, I don't know, like 4 months. This deck is, if you told me the path that this deck took from where it started 3 months ago, maybe even, maybe 4 months ago, like, I'd be pretty shocked. Do you guys feel similarly?
For the most part, yeah. I think some part of this has to do with so when the ban first happened, if you go back and listen to that episode, all these decks so far that we talked about are ones that we kind of mentioned, and this was the one that I kind of put a caveat on, where I was like, hey, this might not look the same or be around still after the Yorion ban, because it was so good against Yorion, and that was a big selling point for the deck. And it's had to almost reinvent itself in some smaller structural ways in the way it plays games, just to kind of deal with the fact that Yorion isn't this free matchup for them anymore, and have to kind of adapt to the metagame and everything that's sort of happened since then. So I do think it's changed a good bit in that time, and then have it to recently have a huge makeover again. And things like now we're seeing the persist be very common, where before it was kind of a thing that maybe you had one or two of and kind of saw a little bit of here and there.
Yeah, to me, like, it was already approaching that 5-color difference, like going all the way away from Grixis into this 5-color deck even before the ban. And at least locally, like, I was seeing the persistent stuff. But the thing that really changes for me is, like, it has really leaned into its control role and like almost acted a lot like Team Escape Shift in a lot of ways, where it is that's like the game it's trying to play. Whereas before it like felt a little cheesy, and now it does not.
Yeah, I think that this deck, like you were saying, it's kind of like a Scape Shift deck in the sense that what it wants to do is just play the game for 4 or 5 turns and then be in a position where it can't lose. In Scape Shift's case, that's you resolve Scape Shift and win the game. But in this deck's case, it's more of resolving your creativity and setting that up. And so all of the cards that it plays to interact with the game have to change alongside the way that the games in the format are changing. And also, I think to keep up with the fact that overall games are a lot harder to decide just off of, being able to force through a creativity against a slower deck like blue-white or like 4-color more often. It's shifted towards doing even more of the unfair angle because that's really the part of the deck it needs to operate in more and more of its matchups than it did previously with 4-color being available for it to farm.
That's so funny because it almost feels like it's also doing that in response to Murktide being one of the best decks, where it's like, if I let Murktide do Murktide stuff, like this deck was really bad against Murktide before, and it feels like it's had to make a lot of adjustments to that.
Yeah, it definitely feels like it needs more redundancy and ways to just kind of force and tax the amount of counter magic that the Murktide decks have. And I think that the reactions that we've seen, not only in the way that they're constructing their things they're actually creativity into, but also just the way that they're approaching their game plan a lot more proactively as a result of Murktide being Kingpin as opposed to Yorion.
Yeah, that and the Ovar tech really catching on in order to stop them has forced them to like change threats again, which is a weird place to be.
I want to move on to the next deck, and I'm curious your guys' thoughts on this. I'm gonna say something. I got a call from a person. They're like, "Hey, here are the 2 decks that I want to play," and I was like, "You should just play Scam." I won't say what the other deck was. I was like, "Scam is like top 3 deck in the format. You should just play it." Scam is operating in a very different space than I feel like a lot of modern decks have operated historically. To the point where this is the thing that I wanted you to distract you, like where modern's getting to like old school legacy style of like ways to attack the format. This deck's different. Like it's doing something very linear. Where you guys land on this deck?
Abe, do you want to go first? I feel like I've talked a lot.
Sure. Yeah, I think Scam has really kind of it's taken all of the most powerful ways you can shut down and interact in a faster manner than Counterspell, right? The ways you can start to pick apart your opponent better than Murktide and really crank those all the way up. And so while it's been losing out on a lot of the ways that it can tango with decks that want to play longer games or have, better answers to their absolute best draws, which involve, basically just grief plus like Undying Evil. Here's a 4/3. You've gotten a Hymn to Turok for your best 2 cards. Good luck. Really forcing the issue on them has made this deck able to beat decks like Hammer and like Murktide in ways that are a little unfair. Like this is a very much a Parmesan deck, if we're going to make this a thing for Mason, where you're playing just all ways to make the game about the card that you just played, and put the onus on the opponent to answer them while disrupting them. And while I think that kind of as the format has developed and will continue to develop, that will get inherently weaker. For now, especially with a lot of the decks kind of moving on from the Yorion ban, trying trying to find their way forward through this kind of format and figure out where they want to be. It really preys on that really well.
Yeah,
it's
I
so
think.
funny. Oh,
There you go.
it was so funny. I was going to talk about the rebirth cheese, but I'll let Mason do that.
Yeah, I think the Rakdos Scam deck is really, really good. I think Rakdos Scam actually has a problem that we see with celebrities sometimes, where it has a bad name and a bad PR. Where when you have the name Scam attached to it, I see a lot of players like legitimately write it off. And it is a very strong deck, like Spencer and Abe were talking about. And I do agree that what it's doing, you can maybe change what's going on. The format change, and then like that's not as strong, but maybe you can adapt to that. But the deck is actually really well built, and it turns cards like Undying Evil, and Malice, etc., into things that are actually like really strong in the deck. So like we talked about Grief turn one, but also it gives you that same sort of Fury Ephemerate that we saw from 4-color, but now in this sort of thing. And doing that on turn one and killing your opponent's. I honestly, just even a Ragavan, you put a 4/4 double strike into play, that's a huge amount of pressure. And you combine that with Blood Moon too, which I think is a really well positioned card. Of the decks we talked about so far, 2 of them are Blood Moon decks, and 2 of them are decks that are weak against Blood Moon. And I think that's kind of a thing that we're going to see as we go down the list as well and talk about even more decks. Blood Moon is really well positioned. So I think Rakdos Scam is a very, very good deck. And there's so many more things we can talk about. We can talk about how like Undying Evil and Seasoned Pyromancer is a combo. We can talk about how just this junk game plan is good. It is just a very real deck. It is high on the list of things I would take to a tournament.
Yeah, I agree. When this first called me, I was like, you should just play that deck. I think that it is actually pretty insane right now. Really quickly though, for those who don't know, because I want to sprinkle in this stuff. What is the interaction that we want to talk about with some of these? You talked about Undying Evil, but like there's a lot of synergies in this deck that I think people don't pick up on at first. The last thing I'll say on this deck is that it has the ability to really play. We talked about, actually, Abe, you talked about like Ragavan and like the best Ragavan deck being like really high up there, right? But like this deck gets to play a card that basically no other deck gets to play in. It gets to play Ragavan, Dothy Voidwalker, a card that people are really excited about in Season Pyromancer. Like its creature suite is super strong, but Dothy Voidwalker on coverage has been both the most like missed card that we've had to like stop games for on coverage. Like, hey guys, like we gotta fix this. And also like, what the heck, Mason? We want to talk about that really quick?
Yeah, Dothy is just really good in main deck graveyard hate. Like Murktide is a deck that needs its graveyard right to get the Murktide and the Unholy Heats going. Breach obviously needs their graveyard. Creativity has some really strong cards that if you end up putting it in the graveyard via countering with Thought Seizing, then putting them into play off the Dothy is very strong. Like, if I play a Dothy and then Thought Seize, you take an Archon Cruelty, put the Dothy in. That's really strong. We also see how Dothy works well with the Undying effects, like Malakir's Rebirth and things like that, where you can target it, sack it to get the thing that was put in exile and put it back into play. So it's just a really strong hate piece that's like a pretty good body that randomly sometimes just takes over a game and just gets the main deck shut off strategies. So it's very good.
Let's move on to Hammer Time. Speaking of Hammer Time, I only see one color in this list in front of me, Abe.
Yeah, Hammer Time continues to be in a spot where you can either play mono white or you can splash blue. That's like most of what people are doing. It hasn't really changed much in that regard. What I will say is changing a lot about Hammer Time, and I think correctly so, is that people are moving back towards Memnite, as opposed to, for a long time, it was like people just wouldn't even let that card touch their deck because of how many Ren and Sixes there were, how much less important it was to play for speed. And now I feel like the format as a whole, because of the effects of decks like Scam or I think cards like Ragavan being much more emphasized in the play patterns of the format, it's just gotten that much better to be trying to get back to being a much more proactive deck instead of knowing that you're going to be dragged into a bunch of long games most of the time by the Yorion decks or by decks that are trying to position for the Yorion decks. So That's been like the biggest thing for me that I've seen that I really like coming back to kind of the Hammer Hive Mind. The deck is still, I think, in a really good position against Murktide. I think that its biggest struggles right now are definitely Scam and the control decks. I think Breach is also kind of close. You have big issues with their sideboard plans that involve them like Emery locking you with engineer explosives, but otherwise, I think the matchups like there's a lot of play to it. There's a lot you can like get them on because all of their removal, other than engineer explosives and like Aether Spell Bomb, you beat with Sigarda's Aid. So it can be tough, but definitely Scam and Control are like the big ones to worry about. So I think overall Hammer's position has actually stayed about the same despite losing its absolute worst matchup in Yorion leaving. And I think that overall the deck should be starting to push back towards being a lot more faster and playing to the board, but we're slowly seeing that come, especially with the mono white builds.
I want to move on to Mason. You were the one that wrote the show notes this week, so I want you to explain kind of this piece around just control decks in general and like how the format has changed to either support control as an archetype that isn't just about value generation.
Yeah, so since Yorion's banning, that was kind of the de facto control deck. You could play other things, but you kind of had this problem where if you played against the Yorion deck as a different control deck, you were going to get over the top. You were going to lose that sort of long game. You couldn't quite actually beat it unless you had some sort of combo finish like Scape Shift, which we saw pop up a little bit during the end of the Yorion lifespan. That was kind of the only way to really outgrind the Yorion stuff. So now that that's gone, there's a lot of like questions about like, okay, well, if I want to play a controlling deck, how do I actually do this? And we've seen a couple different variations pop up, and this really played out at the two energies last weekend going on. So we saw Raja, who is a really good Michigan player, consistently performs well at the Pro Tour, loves playing blue-white control. He showed up with traditional blue-white. He was doing that even during the four-color era, and it looked very strong. It's just very much what you're expecting to see. If you think about modern, actually, ironically, here, thinking back on this, a year ago around today, we recorded an episode post the Star City Games Invitational. And at that time, Blue White Control was looking to be one of the best control decks, and they had main deck Chalice of the Void. And that was a huge element to the deck. And that is coming back now and is still very strong. We saw Raja win the team event doing that sort of thing. Then we actually saw a friend of his and ours of the show, Zach Allen, play a similar deck, but splashing Ren and 6 and having sort of a 4-color deck that's basically blue-white. He has things like Archmage's Charm, which are just like blue, 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 right? So it is a blue-white deck, but has a couple triomes just to cast Ren and 6 in the early turns to make sure you hit the land drops, control the creature decks, and have that little bit of extra oomph to go along. And then finally, the last 4-color when it comes to control decks, we are seeing Kahira and Karuga decks pop up. So the Kahira decks are kind of what people first thought of after the Yorion ban, where it's like, okay, we're just going to play Solitude Fury, maybe like an Omnath or two, a bunch of Leyline Bindings, a bunch of endings, a bunch of counter spells, Ren 6, Teferi. We're going to do all that stuff to win the game, and then take over from there. While the Karuga deck is very kind of different, and I want to emphasize this very clearly on the podcast, and I'm curious to see if Spencer and Abe disagree. I think the Karuga deck is one that people think is a meme, and I think a lot of people thought like, oh, this is just a joke about companions, but it's actually very good and has some precedence for being good in the format, where we've seen Glimpse combo be a thing in the past, along with all the Cascade decks, where essentially that deck plays a bunch of the cards we just mentioned before, but instead of having Prismatic Ending and things like that, it just has more of the bigger answer cards, and has things like Fire, Ice, and Dead Gone, which are a little worse. But in exchange, you get Karuga, and you also get cards like Temporary Lockdown in your main deck, which are like these crazy catch-alls. And that deck kind of goes way over the top of people, and is sort of trying to be the like successor to 4-color. And personally, I think the Karuga stuff is stronger than the Kahira stuff, because it actually just wins the game. So those are kind of like the 4 or 5-ish different control decks you'll see floating around. We're still seeing some scape shift stuff. We'll talk about that later in the show. But yeah, that's kind of the control without having like a crazy combo finish. I know that was a lot. Feel free to take it from here.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that kind of catches people off guard when they hear about people playing Karuga is that Karuga's like, it's the anti-Lurrus of companions. You have to make your deck really clunky and inefficient. But as has been shown by Rhinos, you can play a very solid, fair game built around playing cards that do meet that same kind of deck building requirement of you can't have cards that cost more than 2 because you have to be under that for the Cascade. But what Karuga does in the same way that Yorion does, which is really messed up when you think about it, just how good Yorion was, is that Karuga does the job of being a threat that you can just rely on to actually do something to the game, but also immediately draw a bunch of cards. Like, immediately get way ahead of your opponent if your deck's constructed for it. And while, these Kahira lists are they're much more the traditional control, I will pull ahead incrementally over time, and then slowly the gap will widen. The Karuga deck not only has the tools, but also gets to take a lot of exchanges and then cast this one card and pull so far ahead that it's completely in control of the game. Like, Karuga is everything it needs all at once, whereas the Kahira approach is much more, I'm going to 1-for-1 you and grind you out.
I have 2 thoughts. The first thought is I played ponies, so I played it. I also do coverage on it. Like, I played ponies. I know about this card. My second, I have a question. Does anybody actually think the companion thing is a meme at this point? Like, it's not a meme. Like, it is not surprising that people would try the other companions to see which one could break the format. I think it's not memeing. Like, that is smart deck building at this point.
Yeah, I think that companions have continued to be proven since the moment that they entered Magic that they are by far the most powerful thing printed in the last 10 years.
Oh, easily.
And so not trying to use them is likely a pretty big mistake.
Yeah,
if you can find a way to use them.
I hope that I would emphasize what Mason said. Like, it is not a meme. It's just not. Like, personally, like, I think that you guys have said everything that needs to be said about that specific version. I'm not surprised to see Kira doing well across the board. I think that card has already seen a ton of modern play, and it's pretty free. And, like, we'll continue to see ways to make these effects free for as long as they're in modern.
Yep. Yeah.
And for what it's worth, it will also happen in Pioneer eventually.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I don't want to get too lost in the Karuga sauce, but we also just gave a general overview of Karuga. There are lots of Karuga decks now, and they are all pretty even the one that I think people, when they first saw this one, I think a lot of people thought oh, this is Aspiring Spike being silly, but the Blood Sun Lotus Field Karuga deck is actually one of the more impressive Karuga decks, simply because Blood Sun is so strong right now, in the same way Blood Moon's kind of strong, but in slightly different ways, but still that sort of thing is good. And I think the Karuga decks are at least tier 2 players that if I went to a big tournament and someone revealed Karuga, I would not be surprised and tell friends afterwards. That just wouldn't be a thing. Whereas I think before this, I would have been y'all, I just played against Karuga. And everyone's what? That's crazy! So. Yeah,
I want to talk about some of the decks that have also done well since the banning. And we'll just talk about them quickly. Domain Zoo. This is one of the fastest decks in the format. If you haven't played against it, it is crazy how fast this deck can kill you. Actually crazy. I encourage people to look at it. I don't want to go too deep into it. Scapeshift decks. I think that we've actually covered this in ad nauseum on this podcast. But does anybody have anything that they want to say about them? Amulet continues to do well. Fish is one that I think should surprise people, considering the number of different types of control decks. If Fish becomes a part of the format, that would be pretty interesting. It is not lost on me, though, the problems that Fish have, I don't think have actually gone away.
The one thing I will say, and I think we joked about it on the podcast when the new Lord was printed, that we're like, oh, like the 12th Lord, that's really, like the 20th Lord, that's really going to fix the problems. I will say it having Flash, when lined up specifically against Fury, is big. And like you don't really experience that until like the first time you evoke it. And when it happened to me where my opponent had like a vial up and mana up, and I was like, oh, 3 on this one Lord, 1 over here. Or like just 4 on this one Lord. I want to make sure I killed this. And like you start spreading the damage out too much, and then they flash in the Lord, and you just suddenly lose that. And I do agree that it says a lot of the problems, but that is one small thing that really changed the deck. I think that's helped it a good bit, along with I think that Lord in general has proven to be really good.
Yeah, it turns way more of your draws into those Aether Vial draws that were really punishing in matchups where like you had to rely on like, okay, I'll just bolt the 3/3, and it's like, well, gotcha. Here, counter your thing, counter your removal spell you're really relying on, and I'm pushing more damage next turn. Is just a huge thing.
I'm a little disappointed in Mason for not being anti-Merfolk. I feel like your brand has really been lost on this podcast. And, it's fine. You can switch brands, man. But
I'm a Saloon truther. Don't even get me started on Saloon.
I'm just saying for, like, the old school listeners of this podcast and the beef, like, you're a little lost in the sauce here, man.
Merfolk kind of based right now, I'll say.
Yeah, looking for the Parmesan and that sauce.
Abe doesn't know the beef. So, back when we were sponsored by the man of
Merfolk?
Do you remember the...
Oh, I remember.
Okay.
I remember the beef. Yeah. Dude,
leave
Merfolk
a comment
has
if you remember the beef.
Leave a comment. Does Merfolk fall into the Parmesan theory by having Chalice of the Void in the deck?
Ooh.
That's what I want to know.
Prisintron is
no,
next.
but he says Blood Moon counts.
Prisintron is next. Abe, do you have any thoughts on this deck?
I probably wouldn't play it ever.
I would never play this deck.
It's pretty good. I mean, like, it's pretty good. But
I wouldn't do it to myself. I have friends in
my
life.
Like, I agree with you on decks dropping off on the first one, Mason. Living End has definitely just seen a massive plummet. But Yogg actually won the challenge this weekend.
Yeah, that's kind of one of the few big Yogg things. Yogg won the challenge, and friend of the show, Ash, Shutter MTG on Twitter, she top 8'd the energy. But besides that, a lot of Yogg players are actually moving away from Yogg and kind of saying like a lot of things that are happening in the format are pretty hostile to Yogg. And Yogg can still succeed. It has that combo finish and that proactive game plan along with mana cheat, and I love Yogg. But a lot of things going on around it in the format are having a lot of the players kind of like, I know a lot of them are just not playing Yawgmoth. They're trying to find decks besides Yawgmoth to play.
Last thing that we want to cover is cards that stock has risen. And what's so funny is I want to cover a card that stock has went. With Blood Moon, the rise of Blood Moon. Like, what the heck? There's so many Blood Moons.
Yeah, a lot of Saga, a lot of greedy mana bases, and a lot of creativity, which is like a greedy mana base, but also needs it to be mountains, but they need to also have effects along with
They also
mountains.
need to not be Dwarven Mines?
Yeah, so it's a weird, like I want my deck to be mountains, but not like this moment.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan, and it was funny. I remember the first time I ever played against the 3-color creativity deck. It was one of the 1Ks that I played Murktide at. It might have even been her top 8, and we talked about it afterwards. I don't think myself, Matt, or Quentin had ever seen the deck. It was when it was just Grixis, really new. I was like, yeah, I boarded in Blood Moon, and here's why. Turns out that was a good plan against them. Like, actually, it was really important. I think this card specifically, its stock has gone up, but I think Magus of the Moon stock has been weirdly fluctuating at the same time. Fluctuating, sorry. What do you think about this, Abe?
I think that Magus, for me, I think that Magus' stock has actually gone down a pretty considerable amount. Because Blood Moon stock has gone up a pretty considerable amount, and now it's back at a point where not every deck is just playing a bunch of Besejus, the ability to loot Besejus, which is a big issue for playing Blood Moon that led people to play Magus, which is more traditionally fragile anyway. There's not as much like Eldamri's Calling or like just general tutoring your deck for a creature to find the Magus. And also I think that overall, even the control decks are kind of turning to like Leyline Binding as their catch-all answer. So they already have like the same amount of answers for Blood Moon that they're like they don't feel like they need to play an additional set of amount things to deal with like random artifacts enchantments because they're already playing them. But because the format has Ragavan as like the best card again, they do play a large amount of removal that can just like tag creature in a lot of the decks. So I think that like it would be hard for me to talk about cards whose stock has risen without talking about Leyline Binding, because that card's stock has definitely risen as we see it in like.
Has
all
it risen, or did
now.
it start high and stayed high?
I think it's risen because I think it went from being a card that was only really a consideration as like, oh, is this a marginal improvement to the best deck, to now that the best deck isn't just 4-color deck, it's like, okay, now the Cascade decks that are in better position are playing it. The control decks playing Ren and 6, a big grab to playing Blue-White Ren is that you also get to play Leyline Binding with your many Triomes in your mana base to have this 1-mana catch-all answer at instant speed. And so I think that I would say its stock has risen, but that's just me.
I want to agree with you. I was challenging you to have the conversation on the podcast, but two, I want to bring up a point. Before the bannings, one of the things that my testing team had talked about was, hey guys, and it was me who brought it up. I was like, I'm thinking of cutting Magus. I don't think there's enough Beseju right now, like to warrant this card. Especially like Beseju loops. Like I just don't think that like I have to worry about that right now. And I even like gathered like the number of top 8s that had X number of Besejus in their 75s, and like it was actually like almost, I think actually none of them had 2. But what I think will end up happening is the same thing that happened to Blood Moon when Beseju was printed, where people are like, I can now answer both Beseju and I can answer Leyline Binding. Or sorry, I can answer Blood Moon and Leyline Binding with Beseju, thus increasing Beseju stock eventually, and having that whole cycle that we just had with these cards potentially happen again. Mason, any thoughts on that before we move on?
No, I think that's just true, and that's kind of the cool thing about Magic, right? Is like this happens, so this happens, and we get that ebb and that flow, and like the action and reaction to things and sort of the metagame, and it's like, yeah, there's going to be some weekend where, it is going to be super right to have Magus over Blood Moon. And the people who are typically at the tippy top of the metagame moving forward are the ones who know to make that switch without having to have themselves get got by it at the big events. So
the next one is one that I think we called out, or we being, because I don't think I was on that episode, was Chalice. This is, I think that you guys called this out specifically, that this would happen, or Chalice's stock would go up. Back, I think it was either Jesse or Mason, you guys talked about just blue, white, and Chalice decks being a really big potential. It was factual. This card is now great again.
Yep, it is really good. There are a lot of there are a lot of 1-mana cards in the format. And that's really important. But also there's a good number of zeros. And not in like the Cascade way. We've seen Cascade decks in general kind of dip a little bit. Some people are still Rhino Tree thing. It's a little better than it was pre-Yorion or during the Yorion days. But, things like the Breach deck kind of are weak to a Chalice on 0 when they're on the draw. And so we're seeing the Chalice deck just, be a real part of metagame.
Abe, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's hard to point to any data point stronger than Chalice being good than an Eldrazi-tron deck doing well in an event. And I'm pretty sure Eldrazi tables in the Swiss of the challenge that Corey Bowmeister won with Breach last weekend, where, that deck just, it had a proactive game plan, it had Chalice Void, and all of that together was enough to shut down what's going on around it. And I think that Eldrazi Tron's pretty bad unless Chalice Void is pretty good, because that's like the biggest angle of your deck that's strong.
I think Eldrazi Tron is pretty bad, and Chalice the Void fixes that problem. So, let's move on. Let's wrap up. Like, I think that Modern, it's interesting. A lot of people really liked Modern with Yorion. Like, they actually just thought it was a great format, and I don't disagree. I think that format was really fun to play. I think that there was, in fact, though, when you went back to Paper Magic, the issues that Wizards talked about were true. Where, like, if you had hands like Spencer Howland, it was really hard to shuffle your deck and actually have it be shuffled and actually be able to do it. Like, I remember I played that deck at 1K and I was like, I'm never playing this deck again. Like, it's just not happening. Somebody handed me that deck and I just was like, I'm not doing this. I think that we have to sometimes make those concessions, but I will say that, like, I don't think anybody doesn't think that format was fun, but I think that this format also seems really fun.
Yeah, I definitely don't feel robbed of the experience of what that format was like yet. I don't think the format has, like, drastically changed in any ways without Yorion there, such that a lot of the decks that really made the format enjoyable and all the variety of things you could do, those haven't gone away because Yorion is gone, and I don't think there's any deck that's really stepping in to oppress anything to the level that would stop happening, which is really, really good. I think it's a big reason that I was personally in favor of Yorion going before touching anything like Ren and 6 or any of the other really linchpin cards of the 4-color decks, because I think that while those cards are really powerful, Modern right now is just a format full of really powerful cards that are kind of keeping each other in check and backing each other down, and as long as that keeps happening, I think it's always going to be a fun one to play. I also will say, rest in peace, Yorion, and shout outs to patron of the show, Evan, who can be my witness that it is not that hard to hand over hand shuffle an 80 card Yorion deck, even when it's double sleeved, as I did to his at an RCQ right before the ban. The only thing he did wrong was not get video.
The first thing that Abe and I are going to do when we meet in person is I'm going to put my hand up to his hand, and then I'll be like, you know what, buddy? It's an issue.
Player diff.
Yeah, player diff. You got a good point.
Anyway, Mason, what are your final thoughts?
I think, well, first off, I think you correctly called Spencer out. It is a player diff. This makes it hard for him to just edit that out as well. And then, no, but I think, you know, while my bank account has been hurting from the lack of Yorion in the format, it has been like a really cool sort of metagame, and it's kind of interesting to see what exactly is happening. And it's really cool to kind of see, we're reaching week 3 now of Yorion being banned and having like results since then. And there's not much consensus on what like number 1 and 2 are when you ask like a wide group of players, and especially top players. Like, you'll hear a lot of common overlap, right? Like, you hear Breach or Murktide, and you'll hear Hammer, and you'll hear one of the controlling decks, but there isn't anything like there was before. And I think what kind of happened is we had the Lurrus decks, and those were kind of the best things for a little while. And then the Lurrus got banned, and then it was like, okay, well, Yorion's the best thing now, or Murktide. And it was like kind of those two the whole time. They kind of ping-ponged, and there was a couple weeks where like Living End was the best, but kind of went back and forth between them. And now we're still in that early, really cool discovery phase where it's like, okay, what can we do? What's playable? What's happening? And that's always really exciting. The discovery part of Magic is really fun. So really excited to see that. I'm really excited to see what happens. And I'm excited to get some more Karuga action going. I just like saying Karuga and then drawing cards.
Mason out here trying to get cards banned. He already mentioned Expressive Oration. He's mentioned Karuga. He's on a mission.
I would ban Bobble before Expressive Iteration.
Two equivalently powerful cards, Expressive Iteration and Karuga.
Karuga. I own 6 Karugas. You know,
if did you buy them from Game Grid Lehigh?
No, I bought them from LGS for 25 cents.
Not
a
as
piece.
cool. I don't care. No, I'm just. If you want to support the show, one of the best ways to do that is head on over to patreon.com/ccmtg, become a patron of the show, and you can ask questions in our Discord, such as, how do you test for a big event and decide on a deck? Man, it has been a long time since I played a big event. I'm pretty unfortunate in that Utah doesn't get them. Like, this summit event, if you are coming, come up to me. I'll probably hand you a wristband and say thank you. Is like the first event, maybe just even like on the West Coast in a while. It's I mean, not that Utah's on the West Coast, it's the mountains, but like, it's been a long time. But historically, it's kind of worked differently for me in a couple different ways. How I helped people test for the Pro Tour was different than how I tested for a GP or how I tested for an SEG. How I tested for an SEG was typically, we'd get a group of people together that were going, talk about stuff in like group chats, actually do testing together, and then everybody could kind of like come to their own conclusions as to where the format, well, no, we would come to the conclusion of where the format was together, but like where we attacked from would be pretty different. Like, we don't spend as much time on it. For me, like, testing for a Pro Tour was like really different. And in all honesty, I'm going to say this is how you should be testing for your RC. I'm not doing it because I'm too busy. And even my testing team's not doing it because I think a lot of them are too busy, and we have a huge tournament in Utah the week before. But typically it would involve defining level 0. Like, you need to define level 0 of whatever huge event you're going to before you go there. Once that's done, you should come up with level 0 deck lists, like a baseline of like what you're going to test against. After that, you then need to get together and decide, like, okay, what does this format look like in our heads, and what are the angles that we can attack from? After that, the next step would be, okay, which of these angles do I like, and how do I want to go from there after doing a little bit of testing? Once you do that, it becomes about iteration and doing that cycle again and again and deciding which level you want to be on, right? Because now that you've done that, you've actually reached level 1, right? And then level 2 comes in next, and you say, okay, am I happy with level 1, or do I need to be on level 2? And the number of times where like Team CCMTG, being like Danny, Michael, and whichever other players on our team were qualified for the Pro Tour at the time, we often ended up with the same list as like CFB within 2 cards, or like the other things. And the reason that happened is following that iterative process. That is historically what has worked for my teams. I don't know. What about you guys? Or I'll start with you, Abe.
Yeah, so I think that's a really, really good process. I think it's really easy to get kind of lost in being in the thick of it if you're someone who plays a lot of Magic, of being like, oh, like, I'll just keep playing the thing I'm playing, or do I need to change everything up because this is a tournament and like different than me playing whatever weeklies I play on a regular basis. But I think that really outlining and defining the process in the same way Spencer did, that's like the best way you can do it. If you really spend the time and do your diligence on, okay, this is what everyone will come in with at the start, and this is what the information everyone's working with is, this is the conclusion I draw from that. Then once you have that conclusion, like, is this where I want to be, or do I think there's a better conclusion I can draw by moving upwards from that and really going deeper? What I'll say is, if you're someone who has trouble deciding once they have all the information in front of them on a deck, something that's helped me a lot in the past has been actually something I learned from John Skennick, which was that you should play the deck where you can stomach the losses the best, because ultimately, if it's that close, that is going to be the hardest part of your tournament, is probably like getting through the entire thing, playing at your best. And when you play a deck where, like, if you can't stand playing burn and playing those games where you just like don't draw the last lava spike, or like, your opponent just winds up stabilizing at 2 life and you never close, you shouldn't play burn, because that's just going to mean that you're going to have a bad time doing it, and you're not going to be as engaged or have as good a time. So it's down to like 2 or 3 close choices. Play the thing where there's not going to be as many things that will tilt you about playing it, and play the thing. I try to play the thing that I will enjoy the most.
I want to circle back on something you just said. I hope that what I just said, it might sound really easy. It's actually not. Like, it's like literally, even people not qualified for this pro tour, like we would have, like, I would buy everyone lunch and dinner, and like we'd be at my house for like 3 to 5 days, like just every inch of my house is covered in magic cards, and I would facilitate this. And you have, like, in order to do what I said, it is not a like a small commitment. And I think
it's
that
hundreds of hours.
Yeah, I think when you combine it, it really is. And like when people think like it's we had a I don't know if this actually came on the podcast about like teams. Maybe it did. I think it actually might have been like a podcast fight behind the scenes. But like it is a lot of people being invested at a level that they have. I mean, for you locally, like, no reason to be invested at. Like, you're simply putting in hours and hours of your time for something that you were not qualified for, and you need those people to also have the skill level to be able to productively contribute. And that means that they also have to be engaged at that, right? Like, right now, if I tried to do that for Pioneer, for the RC, I don't think I'd be that helpful. So, you know, while Abe says, like, oh, what way Spencer said is the best, it's only the best in the right circumstances. It is not the best to just do this with, like, a bunch of people that are going to come to the wrong conclusions. So I want to call that out.
Yeah, and I want to clarify. I think that it's the best framework to use, even if you can't do it at the same level. You don't have that amount of man hours, like quality man hours available to you to really get to good conclusions. Like, you can still sit there and think about, okay, these are the best decks in the format or whatever. This is what I think people are going to play, without doing a bunch of work to determine if that lines up with reality of the games, with what I think about the format.
Yes.
Can I rationalize another strategy of, okay, then in that case, maybe I should play something that does this.
Well, and
it doesn't have to be on that same scale every time, but that process of defining the levels and moving through it really does lay a really good framework to
yeah, I agree. Mason?
Yeah, I think maybe just to add on to that, because I think everything these guys have said has been really helpful. Let's like assume you don't have that sort of framework where you don't have people you can talk to. One way to like maybe kind of cheat it, like Abe was saying there, is like look at what people who are invested are saying. Sometimes they're going to keep things close to the chest, right? Like you'll see maybe for this RC or for Pro Tours, maybe you won't see like Reed or Manguchi or somebody like that, right? Like come out and say like they normally would. But there's probably some people, and you can look to them and kind of be like, you know, you could go into like a Twitch streamer and be like, hey, what do you think of this? And try and just like get people's ideas and just do the best you can with the information you have. That's one really good way. Just kind of reach out and get as much feel for that as possible if you can't have that sort of group or whatever, or you're trying to, you know, min-max hours as best as possible. Because that is a big part of it. Like they said, you need to be able to commit that time. And then I think it's funny, kind of what Abe had said about being able to stomach losses, I think is important. But what I was going to say is slightly different, where you have to figure out what your goals are for the event and what you as a person can handle and do. So what I mean by that is, if the only thing you really care about is winning, and you don't care about having a cool deck or hanging out with your friends or anything like that, and all you care about is winning, and that's the case, you should pick whichever deck you think is the best or whatever, or is going to give you the best chance to do that, even if maybe it's not a deck style that you find particularly fun. Because you're saying winning is the main thing. There's no, like, you know, amount of fun that has to do with that. And sometimes you have to do that sort of thing, and it's not, you know, the most, like, enjoyable time or whatever, but you have to figure out, like, what's going to make you happiest long term, right? Like, if you, let's say, top 8 that GP or top 8 the RC, you're going to be probably a lot happier than if, you know, if you're someone who likes winning a lot, than if you were to play some deck, like, let's say, even though I don't even think this is true, like, let's say red black mid range, right? And you're like, oh, I'd rather play red black mid range. I'll have more fun with that. Like, if you're that kind of person, then you might have just way more fun. I mean, like, yeah, I played, I don't know, mono red, and, you know, I top 8 it, and that's way cool. Look, I got this top 8, blah, 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 right? So just kind of be realistic and honest with yourself and make decisions like that. I think a lot of times we assume when people say this sort of thing and you're invested in this show, that typically kind of winning and doing well at tournaments is the main thing, but it's not always the case. And it's not always the case for tournaments too. I've played tournaments where they're kind of like bigger tournaments, quote unquote. But like I was kind of going to have fun for the weekend and do stuff, and like playing the Magic thing was like a thing everyone was doing. It was like a communal event, and I was like, okay, not playing maybe the best thing possible in order to have fun and sort of enjoy my time. So just be realistic with yourself and your goals.
That is going to do it for the Patreon question. Really quickly, I think that this comment on YouTube really applies to us this week. It says, love that we get the real you. Love your content. Cheers, bro. This was in response to actually a comment that I left about the show, the last show. I think that's something that I really appreciate. I'm just going to give a shout out to my co-host here. I think that we get the real us pretty often on this show, where we get to, see. If you know Mason, like, he is very Mason on this show. He does not become less Mason-y. He actually becomes more Mason. Like, if you think you know Mason, like, he's more Mason than Mason is on the show. But you get the real Mason. Like, you get him. And Abe, you're at least from what my interactions with you.
There ain't another me out there, dog.
Yeah, it's just like, it is really fun to do the show with these guys, and I think that brings out us. So it's really appreciated from my perspective. So I wanted to use this YouTube comment to say it. If you want to hear your YouTube comment, talk about the Parmesan in the comments. Speaking of which, let's wrap up. You can find me at Spencer13H. You can find the show at CCMTG on Twitter. And then subscribe, leave comments. Abe, where can people find you?
Find me over at twitter.com/morenothings, where you can also DM me for inquiries about coaching in any and all formats. I actually probably won't have that much time available, as I'm going to be devoting a decent amount of time to helping people prepare for the RC and also preparing for SCG-Con in Philadelphia coming up in like 2 weekends. So it might be hard to get on my calendar for that, but anytime after that, we can always set something up. How about you, Mason?
Awesome.
You can find me over at twitch.tv/TheMasonClark. You can find me here each and every week. You can find me over at Card Kingdom each and every week, writing an article over there. You can find me over on Twitter and everywhere if you want to get coaching, that sort of thing. I have ways to reach out to me about that. We can figure that out. And then finally, I can officially announce that I will be doing commentary for the NRG series starting this weekend. So you can check me out over at twitch.tv/NRG series, I believe is the exact URL. But yeah, you'll see me most of Saturday and all of Sunday. So I'll be in the booth.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody, so much listening. And we'll see you guys on next week with another episode of Constructed Criticism.